Hi, and welcome to another episode of Forward Thinking. I am really excited about our next guest. But before I introduce her, I want to give you a little bit of context. When you walk into an airport, you can see a baggage carousel or a washroom sign, and you know what they're for because they're physical things that are there and they provide affordances. There's a standard language about what to expect and how they work. In a world that is increasingly digital, we don't have those affordances or that accountability or understanding of how things should work and what they're doing for the things around us that are surveilling us. The digital services that might be available from Wi-Fi to cameras to recording devices, and the affordances that are all around us. And it turns out that a group of very talented designers and civic tech people and government experts and startup founders have been working on a solution to this problem. It's called the Digital Trust for Places and Routines, or DTPR. It is absolutely going to change how we interact with the intangible digital side of public spaces and our lives. And I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome a longtime friend of Forward 50. She's been at one physical and one virtual event, and she's on our advisory board, Jackie Liu, for a conversation about what DTPR is and how we can make public spaces and their digital facets accountable and transparent that in the short term will help us to better navigate the world, but in the long term will maybe even restore trust in the public sector. So please give a very warm, forward-thinking welcome to Jackie Liu. Hi, Jackie. How are you?
Good. How are you doing, Alistair?
I'm doing well. It's great to see you again. You're a frequent part of our stages, whether virtual or physical, and on our advisory board. You've been doing amazing work in the fields of smart cities and analytics, both in government and the private sector. And while these forward thinking conversations are usually interviews, I think this one's going to be a little different because you've kind of brought something for show and tell this time, which is pretty awesome. So before we get too into things, can you tell me what DTPR is and what you've been working on for the last little while?
Yeah, so wow, what is DTPR? So I think DTPR stands for Digital Trust in Places and Routines. And we started, it's an open source project that we started. So Patrick Keenan and I started when we were actually at Sidewalk Labs, which was, just the small project in Toronto around smart cities that few people have heard about. And basically what we realized was that what we were hearing was that people needed to know kind of what was going on around them when it came to data collection and digital systems. And so it really kind of DTPR was born out of an effort to try to make that better. And interestingly, I'd say that even though I think this is something that I really think about as something that I dug in deep when I was working on at Sidewalk Labs. When I was at the New York City Parks Department, I ran analytics there. We were starting to experiment with park benches that had Wi-Fi Wi-Fi sniffers on them to be able to measure usage. And we ran pretty quickly into a problem of well, how do we tell people that this park bench is different, that it's doing something to help improve the sort of public spaces? So I've actually been thinking about signs for IoT things in public spaces for a really long time. And so DTPR was just a very specific way for us to think about how do we start to think about helping people, how do we start to address the fact that digital is invisible in the built environment? And so that means that people can't engage with it. And if so much of what we're hearing about smart cities is people want to understand what's happening so that they can hold organizations to account for the use of that technology. If you don't know, you can't have that conversation. And so DTPR was inspired by the universal symbol set that you see everywhere in the world in transportation. So imagine back in the day, you would go to the airport and there's a baggage claim symbol. And no matter what country you are in, you understand what that means and you understand how to use the space. So you don't have to speak the language to be able to navigate and understand what this place is doing for you. Or you think about Creative Commons logos where there's so many complex concepts that are kind of summed up in those CC by some CC symbols that are sort of otherwise pretty arcane.
I think you just said something super important. It's what this place is doing for you. That's a very, very salient sentence. You can unpack that places do things for people. And in the old days, they might be like, here's a washroom or here's a baggage handler. Today, places do things sometimes for people and sometimes for the businesses that own them, but we have no idea what's going on. So it seems like the Internet of Things needs an Internet of Agency to go with it and keep it honest.
Totally. And I think when you think about agency, so as we started to so what we realized pretty quickly as we sort of did our research is that, privacy regulations in multiple jurisdictions, there's lots of regulations that, quote unquote, extend privacy protection out to the offline world. But those mechanisms for notification and accountability are pretty absent or inconsistent. And so we're really looking at how do you come up with a way, the signage that is out there is like either long paragraphs of text, or they're really, really small, or they don't actually give you a venue to follow up and ask questions. And so the fundamental belief of the DTPR project is that people should be able to quickly understand how it works, because that agency, you got to it, like when we found in our user research, is actually what leads to trust. But you can't have agency without accountability, and you can't hold organizations to account without transparency. And so we're starting at that sort of bottom layer of kind of this conceptual triangle of how do you start to foster trust in the way these digital systems work in places. And so we're starting with the transparency piece, because we believe, and what we heard from our from people that we did research with, is that transparency enables them to have that accountability. And with that accountability, then you can have the agency and the trust.
And I think you have a slide that shows that pretty well. So we're gonna do some slides here. This one here.
Yeah, slide.
So
5.
It does seem really interesting that you're like, if you just go to people and say, trust my public space, they won't do it. But you got to ease your citizens, your denizens into that by becoming familiar with it. I remember having a conversation with David McRaney years ago on his podcast about the difference between an algorithm and a human from a legal standpoint. And I think the conclusion we came to is that a human should have recourse. That idea of like, I feel like I have recourse, maybe not agency, but recourse. I know what's going on. I have an escalation process. If I feel this is wronging me somehow, is the basis for the trust of most digital systems.
Absolutely. And I think most digital systems, we don't have that recourse, right? Like, the CCTV camera is there, but who is on the other end? You have no way of finding out. I mean, it could be going to someone's, recording under the hard drive under their desk, or it could be going to the cloud. There's no way to tell just by looking at the device. And so I think starting with something that feels simple, like a sign and a visual language, I think there's a bigger kind of challenge around also like digital literacy and awareness that that kind of, as we think about how we're increasingly living inside the computer, right? That awareness and like the people, the agents inside the computer that are providing inputs into all of these systems that power the places that we live and work in. Like, how do we know what we're doing, how that influences that space? And so I think what was interesting was that, like, when we did some rounds of user research, was transparency piece. But we worked with Code for Canada with their GRIT, inclusive usability testing program. They were just like, definitely, great feedback around the transparency signage, but they were pushing even further. They were just like, okay, this is cool. I understand that this is the data that's being collected and how it's being processed and who's accountable. But they're like, I want to know how often this traffic light slowed down to let someone cross. Like, they were looking for that really tangible measure. And that actually providing that piece of information, like, this is the decision that this system and this data collection enabled for your community, was interesting to see that was actually how people wanted to decide.
I mean, once you're collecting the data, it's going to be, show me some analytics. And I think then it's going to be, I'd like an opinion about how to change the analytics, which sort of shapes public policy. So if you have a view that your city's streets should favor bicycles over cars, for example, this eventually becomes that, where, everyone talks about transparent government, but so much of government is based on data collection and policy change that if you aren't aware of that cycle, you've lost your ability to shape public policy or have your voice heard. So I can see how this is foundational for a much more meaningful shift in how societies govern themselves once this part works.
That is our hope. we have big dreams. I think part of it is that's why we are now, having spent the last year talking to a lot of different organizations and sharing DTPR and working. We did a very small scale pilot with the city of Boston. We've definitely heard from all types of organizations, private sector IoT companies, academic institutions, as well as municipalities and government, that kind of like a shared approach like this is important, because basically there's signs out in the world about IoT and data collection everywhere, but there's no consistency and there's no mechanism for shared learning. Everyone's kind of just either trying something or not getting started because there isn't something that you can kind of like pick up off the shelf and just try. And so that's why we're really thinking about running this cohort, because we believe that there's potential for something like this to be a solution to both that sort of problems for people and thinking about governance, but also a solution to like an emerging regulatory landscape, especially in the US. You have all these different surveillance ordinances being passed. New York City has new biometrics legislation, but there isn't a toolkit or sort of accepted practice. And even privacy regulators in Europe have called for icons or sort of layered approaches to thinking about privacy. I think Brian Boyer, he wrote a small article about DTPR in his newsletter for the University of Michigan. He was like, are you ready for a world where every piece of sidewalk, lamppost, bench has a terms of service and a privacy policy? And how do we make that accessible and approachable for regular people? And how do we also help organizations do that? And how do we learn? That's really what we're trying to do with DTPR right now.
So, I mean, I think this is something that has been a long time coming and maybe is more obvious to the average denizen today than it was. But you've put together a team, and I was struck by the fact that, you've got design and civic tech and startup thinking. Why was that kind of trifecta necessary for building something like this?
So I would say it was partly by accident. I wouldn't say it was by design. So I think that is something to just acknowledge. I think where design has been important from the beginning, because I think there's been any number of governance proposals or like principles around technology of like, this is how we can better govern technology. This is what it should do better for people. But what we found, or what, Patrick Keenan, who started the DTPR project with me, what we felt was like, well, but who's talking to the people? The experts are saying a lot of different things. And how are we taking that and asking folks out in the world that are saying that this lack of transparency, this lack of knowledge is a problem, and actually testing with them? So design thinking was always a big part of the DNA of this project, because it enables, flexibility and learning. It's key for sort of the evolution of the DTPR standard, but also ensuring that this actually works for people and communities. It doesn't just stay in the principles space or in, kind of declaratives. That was reflected in the way we did this. Like, we did initially just first convene the experts, and we talked to experts all around the world. So, if we want to improve kind of agency around technology and make things more transparent, what should people want to know? Or what are the most important things for people want to know? They came up with like 200 things. So that was a lot of things. But when we started to turn them into prototypes of signage and into actual like information sort of assets that we could then put out in front of people, what we learned was that they wanted to know three things. They wanted to know what is this for? What is this doing? So it's a purpose. Who is accountable? So who's behind this? Which gets to your agency sort of question. They want to know whether they can be seen, whether they're individually identifiable. And then they want an avenue to either learn more if they want to, kind of at their own time, and to be able to provide feedback. And so that actually is reflected in the design of the standard itself. So we, and I think slide 12, if you bring up slide 12, this would be a good one. So you can kind of see, so here is what, the DTPR signage looks like for the implementation we did in Boston. And you can see those top level concepts that what people told us was important through the research sessions, with purpose on the top, with the accountable organization, in this case it's the City of Boston. Here we have, it's a computer vision camera that de-identifies on device, and so that's shown in blue here. And the QR code, which gives you kind of that avenue to follow up and learn more. And Alistair, if you could kind of click on the QR code. So imagine you're in the real world, you're coming up to that light pole and you see these symbols and this QR code, and you want to understand, what is this place doing for me, for my community? You can actually scan that QR code and it brings you to what we call the kind of DTPR guide digital channel. And you can see those main concepts reflected in the back at the top. And here you are starting to navigate through what we call the data chain. And so here what we're doing is we're using symbols and a unified visual language to bring people through kind of like a consistent mental model, and always presenting the concepts in the same order. So starting out with accountability, then with the purpose of the technology type, talking about the data type, how it's being processed and accessed. And yeah, it's expandable, so you can kind of drill down and learn more. And I think one of the most important parts is this feedback at the bottom, that we're very explicitly asking people, how does this technology make you feel? Is this information helpful? And so going like a bit beyond the idea of a static sign, and actually creating that feedback loop that people have told us that they're looking for. And how do you kind of make that structured, and organize those learnings in a way that can benefit, I think, organizations everywhere around that are trying to use IoT to improve things for their community.
So you mentioned design, and one of the things I love from the many contributions that design thinking has given us is the idea of the double diamond process. That first of all, you're like, solve the right problem. And then after that, solving the problem right. So solve the right problem is like, what are all the problems we could solve and which one is the best one, which usually comes from user feedback and interacting with the stakeholders. And then once you've decided what problem you're going to solve, what are all the ways we might solve that problem? And then what's the best one? Can you walk me through like your start? You started to mention you got out there and started talking to people, but can you walk me through how that process rolled out over time and what governments can do to kind of replicate that process, since you've obviously succeeded in building at least a prototype this way, and what was hardest about those two diamonds?
So I think, what was hardest about those two diamonds? I think part of what we knew we needed to learn was, kind of, again, solving, I think we're still in the early stages of that diamond. I think we've gone through a pretty robust prototyping process where we've talked to privacy experts and experts in IoT and smart cities. We've also done some user testing kind of as part of our design process. But I think we're still wanting to learn, and this is actually part of why we're running a cohort for this fall, if this actually is going to do anything for people. And I think the reason we also created this as an open source standard is that it needs to continue to evolve, and that we would spark a sort of community around it.
It seems like Creative Commons, before then it was incredibly complicated to try and assign copyright. And Creative Commons was like, you go, okay, I click on this license and I'm done. And it made it dramatically simplifying things and maybe making compromises by, everybody has a special, in the VC world, there's something called safe investing, simple and fast equity. And people go, oh, I'm using a safe document. And then all the VCs stop arguing about terms and conditions. They go, oh, you're using safe? Okay. And it's the same kind of thing with Creative Commons. Oh, you're using Creative Commons? Like Unsplash couldn't have existed without that. It seems like you're doing the same thing for the Internet of Things.
Absolutely. And I think, well, I think that's our hope. I think through the cohort, we're hoping to enable the evolution and the learning. Like, is this actually the right solution? So this is an idea. We happen to care about it a lot. We think it has a lot of legs, but until we get it out in the world and until we get this out in more places, we don't know if we're going to be able to reach that sort of Creative Commons level of success. And so you ask, what can governments do? What can organizations do? Is really, sign up for the cohort. What I've been hearing in so many conversations, again, is this is the sort of thing that we need. This is the sort of thing that we want in the world. So sign up. Like, even if, let us know that you're actually interested. Help us get some sort of metrics around this so we can sort of demonstrate that there is an demand for this sort of thing to exist out in the world. And so that's where I think a little bit of the startup mentality comes in, is like, you need to be able to demonstrate that people want your thing.
So I have so many questions about the startup part of it. First of all, you keep mentioning cohort, but I wanted to make sure everybody who is listening or watching has an understanding of what you're trying to do here. The goal is to make the invisible part of public digital infrastructure visible, transparent, accountable, so people can dig into it, using a set of standards that private and public organizations can all adhere to. And then in the same way that you say, Intel Inside was on all the Intel computers, you're like DTPR compliant, and it becomes something that if you're not doing it as a vendor, you're kind of ostracized, or you're not doing what's possible. And possibly even, insurance is an amazing way to compel behavior, but the law often finds that if you are not negligent if you used the best practices at the time. So it seems like the first time that there's a class action lawsuit against surveillance, and the judge goes, well, you could have used DTPR, but you didn't, therefore you're negligent. And I'm not joking. This is how many big advances in technology happen. Like, the private sector and governments need to get ahead of this, but it feels like it's pretty easy for private citizens to compel their citizens or their governments and private companies to do this by saying, look, this is best practices, Your Honor. If you're not doing it, you're exposing yourself to huge liability. And then the insurers say, if you're not DTPR compliant, I'm not renewing your insurance for your corporate liability, director and officer liability. All of a sudden, everyone adopts the standard. So it seems like there's a pretty good path, like a legislative path, to compelling that just through the courts and liability.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that there is, I think that we would like, though, to put a positive spin on it, that people don't do this because they're afraid they're going to get slapped in the wrist, but that because it actually sparks like a new type of relationship between communities and technology. I am an optimist. I think that we have, a 5-year vision that this gives you superpowers in space, and doesn't just kind of let you know. But I think what I want to, there is that pull, right? Like, there is the legislative push. Like, you see this in the local surveillance ordinances that, that elected officials are like, hey, deployers of IoT, you need to do better. You see this from the privacy regulators when the government of, I can't remember, like in Canada, we have kind of guidelines for meaningful consent. And that kind of starts to get at, what should people be notified about and told in order for you to not have to click a, cookie pop-up every time you walk into a space, because that is the world that we're unfortunately starting to live into, and we haven't sort of solved this. So I think a cohort model, we want to get feedback to make this better. So does this actually solve problems for people? But we also want to learn, does this actually help deployers of IoT communicate more clearly to the folks in their communities in the way these IoT technologies work? So I think it's multi-sided.
To VC startup cohorts like Techstars to see if they can introduce the idea to all of the startups in their cohorts, because it seems like the basic idea is pretty simple, and presumably if even the data about people wanting to know about the data is useful metadata for those startups.
Yeah, I think there's no, I agree. We have not talked to Techstars. We should probably talk to Techstars. I think I come from a public sector background. I spent almost 20 years in the public sector, so that's the space that I know. Just acknowledging my own sort of frame here, and I see that. And so I think we think about this is to solve this problem, we actually need all of these different constituencies. We need kind of the regulators, we need the IoT companies to participate, but we also need sort of the public sector and governments to participate as well. So I think that we do need participation from all of those groups. I think what we're thinking about is, who has the mandate at the moment to clearly communicate with communities about, or to kind of make sure that technology is truly acting in the public interest and sort of more broadly. And so there is one audience that we're thinking about, and City of Boston was a great, like they have made it a priority for them to kind of like spark this conversation with their residents around digital technologies. But we actually do have a number of IoT companies that have reached out to us and been like, hey, this is really interesting. How can we use this? And just we're figuring out how to kind of meet them where they are and what their needs are. But I think we all have this need to communicate better. We don't know if this is the solution. That's why it's open source. That's why we want to run it as a cohort, because only by kind of promoting that shared learning around a consistent toolkit that we can actually start to arrive at that other part of the double diamond. Because I think we're still in the expansion process of the double diamond. But
it certainly sounds like you've identified the right problem, which is how do we make public infrastructure accountable? So you've done the first diamond, and you've got this. It seems like you're right at that point where you've gone, I'm going to put a stake in the ground, which is here's a standard and a cohort and a clearly articulated vision. Now let's go see which thing is it. Is it for scooters like Lime, or is it for cars like Lyft, or is it for park benches or free Wi-Fi or coffee shops or whatever?
Or CCTV cameras or digital wayfinding, or all the things. Yeah.
So I'm going to put on my bad guy hat for a second. How do you stop people from hacking it? Like, what if I just feel like going and putting a bunch of fake DTPR stickers on things to mess with you?
First of all, I think that would be a great sign of traction.
Champagne problem, yeah.
The champagne problem. I did have a kind of brief dream of is there a guerrilla art project in here? Just this mass stickering activity for us to sort of raise awareness that and maybe it's a symbol with a question mark. I don't know what this thing actually is. Let's have a conversation about that. So I think that if somebody hacked it in that way, I'd be awesome. Now we're talking. I think this speaks to once we a sort of future state of what success might look like. I think right now we're still in the test and learn stage, but my hope would be that once we are actually there's demand for this is solving problems for people, likely the governance of DTPR would move out of kind of a startup incubation model, and there may be some other body, maybe a nonprofit, maybe an existing standards body out in the world that could sort of adopt and steward the open source piece, and that there could be a certification process. There could be a sort of membership model. We think about some of these. But right now we still need to kind of be well, does it work? Because and that's
remember those old trustee things that was this site is trustee certified? It seems once the public becomes aware that there's a digital cert that says this is a legitimate DTPR disclosure. But I'm thinking beyond that, with technologies like near field and Bluetooth and Wi-Fi, I remember living in a house where one of my neighbors was very noisy, and another one of my neighbors changed their Wi-Fi SSID to "We can hear you." And I was like, Wi-Fi SSIDs are the new apartment area network. You got like LANs and
That's
WANs, and then
awesome.
you have apartment area networks. But there is an idea here, like you could change the standards around Wi-Fi or near field or Bluetooth so that something pops up, and then you can do some form of digital verification so that as you're walking around, your device is being told these are the properly certified
Yeah,
digital systems around you, and then you're peering into
for
that
sure.
invisibility, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, we're definitely inspired by things like the LEED standard. Like when you go into a building that, kind of it was built to a specific standard around greenhouse gas emissions and climate change and sustainability, that we imagine there's a future where a place might have a sign that says, hey, this is a DTPR enabled place. And I think just because it's a structured taxonomy that describes how these digital systems work and try to present everything in sort of like a structured way. That's the beginning of machine readable. That is an API. And so now you can imagine a future where maybe DTPR is not just a bunch of signs and a website, but it's actually like an open source API to the city. In one of our sort of prototyping and research sprints, we started getting really interested in sort of technological proofs for accountability. So different privacy preserving technologies, ways to, protect data, to protect processing. And we learned about some thinking around personal fiduciary AIs that's kind of promoted by actually one of our kind of emerging coalition supporters, Richard Witt. And what we realized was that actually, if we're successful 5 years from now, DTPR could be the hook that the personal fiduciary AI on your device actually interacts with, to be able to let you know when you're entering a space where data collection or the use of technology might be outside of your personal preference. Because there's an interesting design problem here where IoT is everywhere. If we put a sign on everything, it's not going to be very pleasant to walk around. I mean, I'm just going to tell you, like that's like a lot of stuff. Like in my house, I'm like going through an experiment in my house right now where I'm like, okay, if I was going to label every sensor in my house, what would my house look like? It's a little overwhelming. So I think, like, how does technology then also help? If this turned into an API for a DTPR enabled place, then that actually, I think, gives even more opportunity for different types of modalities.
Yeah, I mean, my background is in network management. My background's in network management, and that idea that you can no longer, like, if you have 1,000 devices in an enterprise, you don't let the management system or the people talk to all 1,000 devices. You have a network management system that sort of collects data from those devices, is the trusted sort of collector and group owner. And any alerts, it's the one that goes, hey, that computer is sending more traffic than it should or whatever, but it's looking for anomalies. And I think one of the changes I'm seeing in the sort of zeitgeist around machine learning and AI is that today AI is used on us. It's used to compel some kind of behavior in a market or a user. And it would be great to see AI being used for us or by us, right? Where you're saying, this agent is looking out for me on my behalf. And I think we're starting to turn that corner, but it does seem like there's a digital divide issue there, where those that have access to the technology, the handset, whatever, but the most vulnerable are unable to see the digital collection systems because they don't have the technology to do so. So how do you think we should reconcile marginalization with this kind of technology?
I think that's a tough question. I'm not sure that we have. I think we would need to, in future rounds of sort of this test and learn, actually engage very specifically with those communities and be like, so this is what we have. We know it's not all the way there, but we need your feedback to think about how this might actually work. I think right now the model we have for DTPR is like, it's a sign, it's a symbol, it's something you can scan on your QR code. I could also see that there might be a future where it's actually maybe just a standalone website and you can sort of investigate it, or a kiosk in a place would let you know that this information is available, so you don't have to have your own device to sort of think about it. It still comes down to, I think how can we put in place the sorts of systems and structures so that this information is systematically available? Because that's actually, I'd say, the root cause of the problem right now, is that the information's not systematically available, and there isn't an easy path for it to become accessible. And once we are able to put in place that sort of like underlying sort of like knowledge base, then we can have a conversation about how do we make it available for different people that have lots of different needs. So
you've
I think
already done a great job just by saying, hey, something's happening here that everybody can access. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely a whole, and this is so often the challenge with innovation like this, is people say, well, if it doesn't solve everybody's problem immediately, but I think you can roundly say that this makes it better for everyone, even though some people might have to ask for help to say, hey, what does that sign mean? And someone with a phone can explain it, right?
Well, you got to start somewhere, right? So I think this is a starting point, and I think that we're not precious that this is the answer, but let's get started together. Yep. That's really why we're, running with this cohort model. So right now we have a website up, we have kind of applications open.
Who's the perfect applicant? So you're doing who's the perfect applicant for this cohort?
I think a perfect applicant for this cohort would be someone who's like, I want to use a technology in this space, but I want to have a conversation with the community that would be, and I need feedback on it. So it doesn't have to be, I don't think, it could be, maybe you're thinking about piloting a technology. Ideally, you're specifically looking for a way to get feedback from the residents and the people who kind of live and work in that community, because this is a way for us to actually think about how we can kind of do feedback a bit more dynamically and sort of like on an ongoing basis outside of, please show up at this public consultation between this hour and this hour at this particular place, which I think is a different type of barrier.
Do you want CTOs from IoT startups attending? Do you want people in civic tech organizations? Do you want government? Who's going to be in the cohort? How long is it going to last? What is the work product that they're going to be delivering at the end of it?
Yeah, so I think we're looking for participation from all of those groups, because I think what we talked about earlier is that this is a very multi-sided problem. It's not solely the provenance of government. It's not solely the provenance of IoT companies. I think if we had some community-based organizations and neighborhood groups that say, hey, we want to, think about how technology is being used in our community right now, that would be really great.
So tell me more about the cohort.
Yeah, so why a cohort model? We decided to do, a cohort is about shared learning, shared experiences, and also sharing the risk, because recognizing that doing things differently is hard. And so this call to action, this cohort for pilots, is also about helping us measure the demand for the standard in the first place. Lots of folks tell us that doing something like this is important, and is it important enough to commit to trying it out? And so this cohort of pilots, what we're really thinking about is, this is what we will help provide the training. We will provide the sort of supports to sort of how to use the standard. We'll, help you implement the signage. We'll help you implement the digital channel in a particular place. We'll kind of feed you like engagement metrics, like how many people actually scan the QR code. That is an open question right now. And then because you can only go so far with just apps, we've also developed an in situ sort of user research and feedback toolkit, so that people can have, a conversation, think person on the clipboard in the intersection. Hey, did you notice the sign? What do you think about it? What does it tell you? And then we synthesize that and learn that back and sort of read that back out to folks that are interested in DTPR and to participate and learn, because I think this is about the beginnings of a new way of thinking about how we deploy IoT in spaces. And so I think it's really important when we think about doing this at scales, like, what are the very real bureaucratic hacks that you might need to get through? What are some of the internal barriers and structures that you would need to work through? And so I think this is what we're trying to deliver with the cohort. We're hoping to start to launch the cohort in October and have it run for kind of like a period of 3 to 4 months. And that will give us an opportunity to learn.
Yeah, I try not to take strong opinions on any of these things because we remain very nonpartisan, but this is amazing stuff and very necessary. Your work with Mozilla suggests that, obviously Mozilla as an organization has strong ties to the W3C and the IETF and other organizations. At what point does this become something that there start to be RFCs around so that people know how to implement against the standard?
I think I am looking before I'm comfortable with sort of approaching these sorts of standards organizations and talking to them about what this might look like for it to become part of these official bodies. I'm looking for proof point that it actually solves problems. It's not there yet. This is like my focus right now is like, get this thing out in the world, get feedback. And I think once we know and see how it works, and we also understand from organizations that are trying to implement this what some of their barriers and blockers are, we'll have a much clearer sense, be able to develop a sense of like, what does it look like to actually approach one of the standards bodies, because this is a very different type of standard. This is not an actual technical standard. I call this a system to people communication standard, so people don't think that this is like about like a new TCP IP. Right? This is about.
But once you start building in near field and other elements, it starts to take on technical components, standardization, verification, and so on. So I could see this quickly becoming something for which there is the equivalent of the W3C, but for, and I love the name Helpful Spaces because it implies, or Helpful Places, is that it implies that places should help us, which is like a wonderful thought. Like, what a great idea. Places should be helpful. It's so obvious, right?
Yeah.
So I have a few other questions, but I know time is short, and you've done a great job of sort of saying what the world might look like in the future. So if I put up these 5 years in the future slides, can you kind of talk me through them, and we'll show them here, because I think you've got a great example of what that is.
Yeah, for sure. So 5 years in the future. So right now we're talking about signs and icons and scanning QR codes. But when you think about, so what does success look like? What's the future we want to get to? Actually, one of this whole journey and what we're about to go through came out of one of the co-design sessions that we had around the standard. One of the contributors that have been kind of giving us feedback as we evolved this as we went, asked us, how does this work in 5 years? Like what? Like if you get this adopted, what does it happen? And so we had been conducting a lot of research looking at mechanisms of accountability and agency, and that kind of led to this increasing excitement for a prospect of a personal AI assistant. And this would be provided by, an organization you trust. And importantly, it knows your preferences. So the AI works for you, doesn't work for anyone else. And so as a communication standard that actually describes, sensors and systems in places, our vision is that DTPR serves as that foundation from which personal AIs can help us provide deeper control over digital interactions in the new world. So in the real world. So when you think about imagining what it would be like to have your digital assistant with you everywhere you go, and as you enter into a place that uses DTPR, you are given a link and you can ask questions. You can see sort of what services are available for you there to interact with. You can see if you want to do anything differently, given the particular context that you're in today. So next slide. So yeah, how it works is fully described and available to you because everything's been described using DTPR, right? So in the next slide, you can imagine that you go to this future library that offers a grab and go checkout system. Next slide. And because DTPR is there, your AI understands that. It understands that there's a grab and go system there, and it can take your personal settings and preferences and apply it to the system. And like any system in the place, it's completely inspectable and legible to you. And because it's the future, your AI helps reduce your cognitive load by essentially doing the work of reading the information for you and letting you know if something is different, kind of outside of your kind of boundaries of comfort, or if you need to take action. So next slide. And so, yeah, so you can learn about all of the systems in a place. So here we see it's like, recycling system. You can keep it high level. You can start to drill down to get all of the specifics. Next slide. Here's kind of like sensor level detail. And yeah, so this was a journey in the day in the life of. So you can start to imagine learning, being able to discover and learn what's around you. Next slide. You can maybe support the artist that you kind of discovered in the plaza as you went. Next slide. And again, this tells you and makes transparent to you kind of how it works and who is behind the system, and who this person is. You can also think about, ordering ahead to a food court, helping you figure out how you find seating, because you can start to all of a sudden be in a future where you're able to see and access what these systems that are all around us actually see. And think about unlocking the door. We already have the beginnings of a lot of these systems now. And I think in this future, at the end of the day, this is an important slide, the idea that you can kind of check in with your personal AI, review all of your transactions and the interactions that you've had with the world today, and change anything that might be necessary. So again, it's about really making everything sort of inspectable. A vision of the future where with this type of communication standard, there can actually be sort of new types of interfaces for the places where we live, work, and play. So that is this is the helpful places future that we hope to get to. Signs and QR codes are like little.
It's after all the doom scrolling of the last 2 years, it is so refreshing to go, that looks like a good world. Now, accessibility, marginalization, there's tons of hurdles to overcome, which is why I think the fact that you started with sort of simple physical QR codes to make it like, and I kind of want to coin like it's instead of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's Lou's hierarchy of helpful places. But that idea that first you got to get transparency, and then eventually you work your way up to agency. And that seems to be the problem that many of the rather techno-utopian efforts to make smart cities have overlooked, is that you need to build trust. You need to explain this and sort of ease the population into understanding how their city works. With an eye, and I can just see, even down to the point of political accountability. This system was created based on this law, which used this much of taxpayer dollars. So now I know where my dollars are going. That's incredible. And it leads to a whole, like one of the problems that we're seeing, and we talked about this last year at Forward 50, is the epistemic crisis of democracy, that we've gone from a world where you had a few sources of truth. And they may have been lying, they may have been racist as hell, right? But you had like 5 newspapers and 3, maybe 10 radio stations, but it was relatively few, broadcast one to many. And as a result, we got a consensus among the population. Today, any person can broadcast to millions of people within seconds for free. And it's leading to this kind of epistemic crisis and mistrust of public systems. And it really feels like the way you reestablish that and show people that collective action and paying your taxes and voting for principled investment in infrastructure around us needs this kind of accountability. So I think that on a profound level, this does more than just, give people recourse or help them understand the digital invisible world around them. It can reestablish faith in collective efforts if it's done right.
That is the hope.
Well, it's a very good hope. Jackie, as always, it's fascinating talking to you. I know we've gone a little long here, but I wanted to make sure we talked about this. And this is like amazing stuff. Thank you for bringing it to us. We want to share it with everyone. Again, how do people get involved if they want to join the cohort?
So if you go to, we have a website, it's dtprcohort.helpfulplaces.com. That is where we're kind of have our call to action. We can describe what the cohort is, what it looks like to participate, and there's an application form. And so we are taking applications right now. We are going to be reviewing them on a rolling basis until September 1st. And from there, we hope to select, it's not even select, identify 5 to 10 places and organizations that want to take the first step to trying this out and, helping us move towards that future.
If some of the big tech companies want to found the foundation or get involved or sort of sign on and endorse it, they can just reach out to you and say, hey, this is a good thing. I'd like to throw some.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, definitely. And they can reach out to me. We've got an email address. It's but they can reach out to me. It's Jackie at JACKIE at helpfulplaces.com to just reach out. We do think it is important for all of the participants in the cohort to be at least partly self-funded in participation, because I think innovation is hard, and part of showing that you're committed and ready to try something is actually in government or in whatever organization you're in, going and getting the budget to be able to do so. But I also recognize that, municipalities in particular are at a very tight sort of moment in their budget cycle. And these are things that, maybe are a little bit on the edge of what they feel like they could be doing. And so we're absolutely looking for, kind of additional support to help make it possible for these organizations to sort of get out there into the world and try this out, because it really is about that multi-sided conversation, and everyone needs to participate. So,
well, I mean, it looks like you've done a tremendous amount to get the ball to places where some of the other people can hit it and try stuff out, right? Like, you've put a stake in the ground, and this is amazing. I think the design is clear, the vision is clear. So thank you so much for doing the hard work to, show people what can be, and then hopefully others will jump on that bandwagon and actually take you up on that challenge. But this is amazing. Thank you so much for sharing it.
Thank you so much for having me.